What if medieval peasants ate better bread than you? Not despite their poverty, because of their process. In the early 1300s, a working peasant in England consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread every single day. Even among the English nobility, grain provided 65 to 70% of total calories. For ordinary laborers, that share was almost certainly higher. Based on what historians have pieced together, an adult peasant male may have burned anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 calories per day. Estimates vary, but the physical demands were enormous. Hard labor, no machinery, no days off. And the bread kept them standing. They built cathedrals on that bread, survived winters that killed livestock, worked 12-hour days in fields with no supplements, no protein shakes, no multivitamins. They raised families on it, fought wars on it, crossed continents on it. Today, bread is the thing your doctor tells you to cut, the thing blamed for bloating, weight gain, blood sugar spikes, inflammation. Walk into any health food store and you'll find an entire aisle dedicated to avoiding it. Same word, same shape, completely different food. So what changed? Not your body, not your stomach, the bread. Let me take you back. For 6,000 years, from the first baked loaves in the Fertile Crescent to the end of the 19th century, bread depended on natural fermentation. In the ancient world, that meant sourdough, flour, water, salt, and a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria. During the Middle Ages, bakers in England and other parts of Europe often used barm, yeast skimmed from the beer brewing process, as a faster alternative. In France and much of southern Europe, sourdough starters persisted. But whether they used sourdough or barm, the principle was the same. Living organisms, time, and fermentation were doing the work. That's not a recipe, that's a relationship. The starter, or the barm, was alive. In parts of continental Europe, particularly France, families appear to have kept sourdough cultures for generations. Monasteries maintained them for centuries. In England, brewers and bakers worked hand in hand. The ale produced the barm, and the barm leavened the bread. You didn't buy yeast in a packet, you cultivated it, or you collected it from the brewing process. Either way, it was a living thing, and in return, it fed you. When a baker mixed flour and water with that starter, something remarkable happened. Lactobacillus bacteria and wild yeast began working together in a symbiotic dance that scientists are still studying today. The bacteria fermented starches the yeast couldn't reach. The yeast metabolized what the bacteria left behind. Carbon dioxide lifted the dough, organic acids transformed it, and the flavor, that deep, complex, slightly tangy character, that was the signature of life at work. This process took time, 12 hours, sometimes 24. And that time wasn't wasted. Every hour of fermentation was doing chemistry that modern factories skip entirely. Records from Westminster Abbey in the late 15th century show monks received over 2 pounds of bread per day as their standard ration. The Roman Empire imported wheat from across its territories to produce leavened bread at a massive scale. Pliny the Elder himself described the use of fermented dough as leavening. And based on archaeological and historical evidence, workers who built the Egyptian pyramids appear to have received the bulk of their calories from naturally leavened bread. This wasn't peasant slop. This was the engine of civilization. And it worked, in large part based on what we now understand, because of 3 mechanisms that modern industrial bread production has drastically reduced or eliminated entirely: fermentation, mineral access, and blood sugar control. Let me show you each one. Here's where it gets interesting. When sourdough ferments for 12 to 24 hours, lactic acid bacteria produce organic acids, primarily lactic acid and acetic acid. These acids drop the dough's pH to somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5. At that acidity, something critical happens to gluten. The proteins that make up gluten, gliadin and glutenin, begin to break down. The bacteria are pre-digesting them. Based on what researchers have observed, enzymatic activity in that acidic environment appears to cleave apart protein structures that would otherwise reach your gut intact. By the time that bread hits your stomach, a meaningful portion of the digestive work has already been done. This is why sourdough fermentation has been associated with reduced symptoms in people sensitive to wheat. The fermentation process breaks down components that may contribute to digestive discomfort. It's not that the gluten disappears. Sourdough is not gluten-free, but the structure of that gluten changes. It's been partially dismantled, pre-chewed, if you will, by a billion microscopic workers who asked for nothing in return except flour and water. But here's the part nobody talks about. Modern commercial bread doesn't ferment. Not really. Industrial baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, was isolated and mass-produced starting in the late 1800s. It replaced millennia of diverse natural fermentation with a single monoculture organism optimized for one thing: speed. Commercial yeast raises dough in under an hour. Some factory processes prove dough in 45 minutes. That's not fermentation, that's inflation. The yeast produces gas, the dough rises, but the complex biochemistry, the acid production, the protein breakdown, the flavor development, none of that has time to happen. Time is an ingredient, and they removed it. Now, nobody mentions this part. Whole grains contain a compound called phytic acid. It's concentrated in the bran and outer layers of the kernel. Phytic acid binds to minerals, iron, zinc, magnesium, calcium, and forms insoluble complexes. You eat the minerals, but your body can't absorb them. They pass right through. This is a real problem, especially if grain makes up the majority of your calories, as it did in medieval England, where bread, porridge, and ale combined provided an estimated 65 to 70% of total intake, even among the nobility. For peasants, that figure was likely higher. So how did medieval populations avoid mass mineral deficiency? Fermentation. Research published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry found that sourdough fermentation reduced phytic acid content in whole wheat bread by 62%. Standard yeast fermentation, only 38%. Another study demonstrated that with a modified approach, pre-soaking the bran with microorganisms before bread making, followed by extended fermentation, phytic acid reduction approached 90%. That's a near-complete elimination of a compound that would otherwise lock your minerals away. A separate study confirmed that sourdough bread was a significantly better source of bioavailable magnesium, iron, and zinc compared to yeast-fermented bread made from the same flour. Medieval bakers didn't know the word phytic acid. They didn't need to. Their process solved a problem they couldn't name. Not magic, just time and bacteria doing what chemistry demands. Let me give you a number. Sourdough bread has an estimated glycemic index of around 54. That's considered low, meaning a slower, gentler rise in blood sugar. Processed white bread, between 71 and 75. That's firmly in the high category. On a scale where pure glucose is 100, that's a significant gap. And research suggests the real-world impact matches what the numbers predict. A clinical study on pregnant women, both healthy and those with gestational diabetes, compared standard white wheat bread to whole-grain sourdough bread. The white bread triggered 45.5% more insulin secretion in the first hour. Now, to be fair, that comparison includes two variables. The grain was different, and the fermentation was different. We can't attribute the entire difference to fermentation alone, but the pattern is striking. Your medieval ancestors ate 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day. Grain dominated their calories, and while we can't run blood panels on people who lived 700 years ago, what the archaeological and historical record does suggest is that the chronic metabolic diseases we associate with modern grain consumption, widespread insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, were not described as common afflictions of that era. There are many possible reasons for that. Shorter lifespans, vastly different activity levels, but the bread itself, how it was made, how it was fermented, almost certainly played a role. What changed wasn't how much bread we eat, it was what we did to the bread. Let me show you why. During sourdough fermentation, lactic acid bacteria produce organic acids that interact with starch molecules during baking. Research suggests these acids promote the formation of resistant starch, starch that resists digestion in the small intestine. Resistant starch passes into the large intestine, where gut bacteria ferment it into short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate. Butyrate is associated with reduced inflammation in the gut lining and improved intestinal health. There's also a mechanical effect. Acetic acid, one of the primary acids in sourdough, has been associated with delayed gastric emptying. Your stomach processes the bread more slowly, releasing glucose into your bloodstream in a steady stream rather than a flood. A systematic review published in 2022 examining 18 clinical trials found that sourdough bread consumption was associated with lower postprandial blood glucose at both 60 and 120 minutes compared to industrially fermented bread or glucose controls. Now, the science isn't unanimous. A 2023 review in Frontiers in Nutrition noted that some individual studies showed no significant difference, and that grain type, flour coarseness, and product structure all play roles beyond fermentation alone. Fair. Science is messy, but the pattern is consistent enough to raise a serious question. If slow fermentation may reduce glycemic impact, reduce phytic acid, and partially break down gluten, why did we stop doing it? 1961, Chorleywood, England. A small research facility in a quiet village invented a process that would redefine bread for the entire Western world. The Chorleywood Bread Process. The idea was straightforward. Britain was importing expensive high-protein wheat from North America because domestic wheat wasn't strong enough for traditional bread making. The researchers at Chorleywood asked, what if we could use cheaper, lower-protein British wheat instead? The answer was intense mechanical mixing. High-speed machines that pumped enormous energy into dough in about 3 minutes, developing gluten through brute force instead of time. Imagine a mixer spinning so fast it heats the dough from friction alone. So fast they had to install cooling jackets around the bowl to keep the temperature from ruining the batch. But speed created problems. The dough was unstable. Without hours of fermentation to build proper gluten networks, the structure was weak. It collapsed. It didn't taste right because flavor comes from fermentation, and there was no fermentation. It went stale quickly because the organic acids that naturally preserve sourdough were never produced. So they added things. Fast-acting oxidizing agents like ascorbic acid and potassium bromate, hard fats and fractionated oils to prevent collapse, emulsifiers to bond fat and water, 2 to 3 times the normal quantity of yeast, soy flour for protein and volume, enzymes, amylase and protease classified not as ingredients but as processing aids, and preservatives like calcium propionate to fight mold. By 2011, 80% of all bread sold in the United Kingdom was made using this process. It spread to over 30 countries: Australia, South Africa, Turkey, parts of France, and beyond. Flour to sliced and packaged in 3.5 hours. Thousands of years of natural fermentation replaced in a single afternoon. And here's the detail that should concern you. In many countries, enzymes used in the process are classified as processing aids, not ingredients. They don't appear on the label. You can't avoid what you can't see. Optimized for shelf life, not survival. Let's look at this. A typical supermarket loaf contains between 15 and 25 listed ingredients. Some contain more. Wheat flour, water. So far, so good. Then, high fructose corn syrup or sugar, soybean oil, salt, yeast. That's already 6. Then the second tier, monoglycerides, diglycerides, calcium sulfate, sodium stearoyl lactylate, diacetyl tartaric acid esters. These are emulsifiers and dough conditioners designed to make industrial processing possible. Then preservatives, calcium propionate to inhibit mold, sorbic acid, sometimes potassium sorbate. Compare this to the label on sourdough: flour, water, salt, starter. 4 ingredients, one of them alive. Here's the uncomfortable comparison. Modern industrial bread, fermentation time under 1 hour, shelf life 7 to 14 days. Medieval naturally leavened bread, fermentation time 12 to 24 hours. The organic acids produced during fermentation act as natural preservatives, and historical accounts suggest that properly baked loaves could keep for weeks in cool, dry conditions, far longer than their modern counterparts. Less chemistry in the recipe, more chemistry in the process, and the bread lasted longer. Convenient, fragile. Consider this. The Chorleywood process wasn't invented because the old bread was bad. It was invented because the old bread was slow. Slow means fewer loaves per hour. Fewer loaves means less revenue. Less revenue means smaller margins. And in post-war Britain, the goal was clear: feed the nation cheaply. Keep the price of bread low. Protect domestic wheat farmers from being undercut by North American imports. Noble intentions, perhaps, but the consequences rippled forward for decades. When you compare a 3.5-hour production cycle against traditional overnight fermentation, it's easy to see the economic pressure. A factory running continuous batches through the Chorleywood process can produce dramatically more bread per day, by some rough estimates several times the output of a traditional bakery. Think about that. A traditional baker running one batch of sourdough per day is competing against a factory running continuous shifts. The economics are brutal. The traditional baker doesn't stand a chance on price. That bread is softer, whiter, and cheaper. It's also less nutritious, harder to digest, and dependent on a cocktail of additives that didn't exist before 1961. The bread didn't get worse by accident. It got worse by design. Every shortcut was a business decision. Every additive solved a problem that only existed because time was removed from the equation. Shorter fermentation saves time. Cheaper wheat saves money. More additives solves the problems created by saving time and money. It's an elegant loop if you're the one selling the bread. Built for replacement, not longevity. Not the bread, the customer. You buy it, it goes stale, you buy more. The loaf that could keep for weeks was bad for business. 3 things you can do, starting today. 1. Read the label. If your bread has more than 6 ingredients, question it. If it contains emulsifiers, dough conditioners, or preservatives you can't pronounce, understand what you're eating. You deserve to know. 2. Seek out long-fermented bread. Look for bakeries that use sourdough starters and ferment their dough for 12 hours or more. Real sourdough doesn't contain commercial yeast. The ingredient list should be short: flour, water, salt, starter. Some farmers markets carry it. Some artisan bakeries will tell you their fermentation time if you ask. And if they won't tell you, that tells you something too. If you're ambitious, make your own. A sourdough starter requires nothing but flour, water, and patience. You mix equal parts, leave it in a warm place, and feed it daily. Within a week, it's alive. Within 2 weeks, it's strong enough to raise a loaf. Then it's yours for life. You can pass it to your children. People have. For thousands of years, people have. 3. Consider heritage grains. Einkorn, emmer, spelt. These are ancient wheat varieties that were standard in medieval and pre-medieval bread making. Research suggests they may contain different gluten structures than modern dwarf wheat. Some people who report sensitivity to modern wheat find heritage grains more tolerable. You don't need to go medieval. You don't need a stone mill or a wood-fired oven. You just need to give bread back what the factories took from it: time. For thousands of years, bread was simple: flour, water, salt, and some form of living fermentation, whether a sourdough culture passed from one generation to the next or barm skimmed from the local brewer's vat. It fed the workers who built the pyramids. It sustained medieval Europe through famines and plagues and winters that froze rivers solid. It traveled with Roman legions across the Mediterranean. It was baked in communal ovens where entire villages gathered. It was broken at tables where treaties were signed and prayers were said. It was the staff of life, and it earned that name. Not through marketing, through millennia of proving itself, one loaf at a time. Then, in 1961, in a quiet English village, someone decided that 3.5 hours was better than 24, that cheaper wheat was good enough, that additives could replace biology, that speed was more important than substance. And the world followed. 60 years later, bread is the most consumed food on earth that people are actively told to avoid. We have gluten-free aisles, low-carb diets, grain-free movements, entire industries built on the premise that bread is the enemy. But bread was never the enemy. The bread didn't betray you, it was replaced. Old ways aren't magic, they're physics, and physics doesn't care about production schedules. Subscribe. The old ways remember what the new ones forgot.